Hollow Tides of the Drowned God. Chapter 7. The Taste of Real Water. The noise was a physical weight. Jorin curled tighter in the corner, pressing his palms against his ears, a futile gesture against a storm that raged inside his skull. It wasn't just the memory of his Liana anymore, her small voice lost in the shriek of tearing metal. Now it was a choir of terror, 1,000 panicked thoughts screaming at once. The collective fear of the quarantined Sump had found a channel, and it was him. "My kids in Hab 77B, are they sealed in? Oh gods!" A woman's frantic prayer. "We're out of water. The tap just hissed. They're going to let us rot. They're going to let us rot. Rust, rut, rust, rut." The voices overlapped, a static of pure desperation scraped raw. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the images came anyway. A flickering emergency light, glinting off a desperate face, the dull sheen of an empty water pitcher, the dark shape of a bulkhead door that would never open again. Here, in the derelict pump station that Grendel Brekker called his throne room, the air was thick with the scent of ozone from a sputtering junction box and the damp, metallic tang of the city's slow decay. A single sodium vapor lamp cast a sickly orange pall over everything, making the shadows writhe like living things. Heavy bootfalls on the grated metal floor cut through the external quiet. They were a hammer against the anvil of his focus, momentarily scattering the internal chorus. Jorin flinched, peeling himself away from the cold, sweating wall. "Still praying to the hull?" Grendel's voice was as rough as unfiled steel. He stood over Jorin, a silhouette against the orange light, broad-shouldered and solid. He didn't smell of the Sump's mold and recycled air. He carried the sharp, peppery scent of glimmer moss and something else, a clean, machine oil aroma of things that worked. Jorin didn't answer. He just breathed, trying to surf the receding wave of psychic noise. Grendel yelled a sound of profound impatience, a mix between a scoff and a "I'm not paying you in floor space and protein paste to meditate, Jorin. I need the spook. I need you to listen." He crouched down, the worn fabric of his trousers straining. He wasn't cruel, not in the way Praxilla Var was. Grendel was something far simpler, a pragmatist, a predator who had found a new, sharper set of teeth. He shoved a flickering datapad into Jorin's line of sight. On it, a crude blue schematic of a service corridor, section GAMMA9. A blinking icon indicated a convoy. "Sustenance is moving a medical cache," Grendel said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial grumble. "Real Sun D, broad-spectrum antibiotics, coagulants. Not for us, of course, for Spire-born with the sniffles. It's being moved from storage Epsilon to the upper-level elevators. Heavy guard." Jorin pushed the datapad away. "No, Grendel, I can't. It's too loud today. It hurts." The words felt like dragging stones across his tongue. The mere proximity of the schematic, a map of other people's intentions, made the whispers in his head begin to coalesce again, sharpening into painful points. "Hurts," Grendel almost laughed. "Being spaced into the abyss hurts. Getting your skull cracked open for a half-liter of real water hurts. This," he topped the datapad insistently, "is a business transaction. My protection for your talent. You want the noise to stop? Help me get the things that will make people quiet. Food, water, medicine, power. That's the only language anyone in this rust bucket understands right now." He wasn't wrong. Jorin could feel it. The hunger, the thirst, the terror, it was a constant, deafening roar. But to focus, to deliberately sink into that ocean of feeling and pluck a single thread of useful information, it was like holding a live hydrospanner to his temple. "I need quiet," Jorin rasped, the plea tasting like failure. Grendel's expression hardened. "There is no quiet, not for you, not anymore. But I can give you silence. A sealed room, a private water line with its own filter, a goddamned mattress. You can have a slice of the spire right here in the Sump. All you have to do is pay the toll." He pushed the datapad into Jorin's hands. "Now look, find me the weak link, the loose bolt, the nervous guard, the part of their plan that's already broken." The cold plastic of the datapad felt like an anchor, dragging him down. Jorin's fingers trembled as he held it. He stared at the blue lines, the sterile representation of a place he'd never seen, but could suddenly, horribly, feel. He closed his eyes. He let the torrent in. It wasn't a choice, it was surrender. The general panic of the Sump faded, replaced by a focused stream. He was a radio, and Grendel had just tuned the dial. He felt the cold sweat on the palms of a guard named Kale, his third double shift, his mind on the rumors about the water, not on the path ahead. He heard the faint, high-pitched whine of a specific cargo hauler's motor. The bearings on the port side drive wheel were nearly ground to dust. It was imperceptible to a normal ear, but in his mind, it was a scream. He saw through the eyes of the convoy leader, a woman named Isha, her gaze flicking nervously to a pressure gauge on the wall. A tremor tide was forecast, minor, but they all felt minor until they weren't. And then he felt the metal. The choral echo was in the city's bones, and he was part of it. He could feel the strain. A section of floor plating, right at junction 9 Delta, where the convoy had to make a sharp right turn. The undersupports were corroded. Decades of leaks. The city's constant groans were a language he was now fluent in. This one was a whisper of imminent failure. Jorin's eyes snapped open. He was gasping, a sheen of cold sweat on his brow. Grendel watched him, his gaze sharp and avaricious. "The turn," Jorin choked out. "At 9 Delta. They'll slow down for it. The floor plate, it won't hold the weight of all 3 haulers at once, especially not the lead one. Its drive wheel is shot." He didn't know how he knew. The information was just there. A memory that wasn't his. "The plate will buckle," Jorin continued, his voice gaining a strange, distant confidence. "Just for a second. The lead hauler will lurch. The driver, Isha, is already on edge about the tremors. She'll overcorrect." He pointed a shaking finger at a spot on the schematic. "Right here. She'll swerve, and the corner of the hauler will clip the conduit housing for the secondary comms line. It's a blind spot. The guards in the rear won't see it happen for at least 10 seconds. 10 seconds is all you'll need." Grendel stared at the datapad, then back at Jorin, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. It was the look of a man who had just been handed a key. He didn't question the source. He didn't care about the metaphysics of the miracle. He only cared that it was profitable. "Deep and safe, Jorin," he said, the old greeting sounding like a contractual agreement. He stood up, snatching the datapad. "You've paid your toll for today." He turned and barked orders to 2 of his Tide Lords lurking in the shadows. Their response was immediate. They were ghosts in the orange gloom, grabbing tools and repurposed shock pikes. As Grendel left, he tossed a small, dense nutrient bar and a metal flask at Jorin's feet. They clattered on the grate. The toll paid. and received. Jorin didn't move. He stared at the wall as the sound of Grendel's crew faded. The cacophony of the Sump rushed back in to fill the void, but it was different now. A new voice had joined the chorus, a low hum of anxiety from a convoy leader named Isha, a woman he had just condemned. He had wanted quiet. Instead, he had only learned how to weaponize the noise. The Compliance Division Command Center was a chapel of cold light and humming silence. Here, in the administrative peak of the spire, the eternal groan of Amphitrite's hull was a distant, theoretical problem. A low-frequency hum filtered through layers of sound-dampening alloy and polished obsidian. Chief Compliance Officer Praxilla Var stood at the center of the room, a stark silhouette against a three-dimensional holographic schematic of the Sump. The districts below glowed in a lattice of sterile blue light, marred by angry, pulsing icons of crimson. "Final assessment, analyst," Praxilla said, her voice cutting through the quiet hum of the servers. She did not turn. Her eyes remained fixed on the tactical display. From a recessed console, a young man's voice, strained and deferential, replied, "Ma'am, the incidents align with our predictive models for infrastructural decay in a high-stress, sealed environment. The aqueduct beta rupture, the gamma-7 power failure, the vent shaft 9C blowout, they're all within expected parameters for catastrophic failure. Unfortunate, but statistically inevitable. A cascade of stochastic decay."
Praxilla's hand sliced through the air, dismissing him. Stochastic, a word for patterns you were too lazy to find. She tapped a shimmering pane of light, and the Sump rotated before her. Grendel Brekker's Tide Lords hit a synth protein cache 2 minutes after the aqueduct beta rupture diverted compliance patrols. They seized a crate of black market catalyzers 60 seconds after Gamma-7 went dark, disabling the corresponding maglocks. They were in and out of a glimmer moss farm in the 4-minute window the 9C blowout rendered the access corridor toxic. Do not speak to me of coincidence. Her fingers, sharp and precise, danced across the holoscreen. She isolated the 3 incidents, pulling up their engineering post-mortems. The data streams flowed around her like ghostly ribbons. Rust rot, metal fatigue, seal degradation. The official explanations were neat, tidy, and utterly insufficient. They explained the how, but not the when. The timing was too perfect, too surgical. It was the work of a phantom, a ghost who knew the city's secret aches and pains better than the engineers who'd built it. Grendel Brekker was a brute who dealt in salvaged hammers and intimidation, not a prophet who could divine the precise moment a 20-ton pipe would choose to give way. Praxilla felt a familiar vibration through the soles of her immaculate boots, a deep, resonant shudder from the abyssal foundations. The hull is the whole, the city's first and only law. And the whole was groaning, a beast in agony. It was a sound of chaos, of entropy winning. What she saw on this map was the opposite, a scalpel of chaos applied with impossible precision. It was an affront to her entire philosophy. "The models are wrong," she stated. It was not a question. "Run them again." "Ma'am, we have," the analyst's voice quavered slightly. "The probability of a single actor correctly predicting all 3 failures is, well, it's functionally 0. Less than 1 in 10 billion. It would require real-time substructural stress sensor data. No one has that access, not even us."
Praxilla's jaw tightened. She hated anomalies. They were like rust, a sign of impurity in a system that demanded perfection. She swept her hand across the display, the crimson alerts vanishing, leaving only the cool blue grid of the Sump. She stood in the silence for a long moment, the hum of the life support system a steady artificial breath. Her logic was a fortress, and this data was a tide beating against its walls. If the actor couldn't see the system from the outside, perhaps they were feeling it from the inside. A cold tendril of a thought, unwelcome and alien, began to uncoil in her mind. "Patient zero," she murmured to herself. With a flick of her wrist, a new file bloomed in the air. A face, gaunt and haunted, resolved from the pixels. Jorin, deep-sea welder, class 4. A man whose psychological profile screamed of guilt and sublimated trauma long before the infection. She pulled up his last known work logs, his patrol routes through the Sump's maintenance arteries, the places he knew as well as the lines on his own hand. She began a new overlay. Jorin's routes appeared as a web of faint golden light. Then she plotted the locations of Grendel's heists. Red stars on a blue map. They overlapped. Perfectly. Each raid had occurred in a sector Jorin had been responsible for maintaining at some point in the last 5 years. It was a connection, but a weak one, circumstantial. Any of the welders on his crew would have the same knowledge. "It's not enough," she said, her voice low. The logic was incomplete. The fortress walls held. Then she remembered the other incident, the one that had been flagged not as a crime, but as a miracle. The sub-level 4 water main burst just after the quarantine had slammed shut. The one Jorin, on the scene by chance, had single-handedly helped contain. The reports praised his preternatural intuition. He'd pointed to a specific joint, a place no schematic showed was compromised, and told them where to brace. He'd saved hundreds from being crushed or drowned in the initial chaos. A hero. Praxilla's lips peeled back in a humorless smile. She pulled the file on that incident. A new star, this one a bright pulsing yellow of heroism, appeared on her map. It was deep within the geographic cluster of Grendel's other heists. Now for the final piece. She dragged one more data stream into the matrix, the one she had walled off in her mind as a medical problem, a biological contagion to be purged. It was the telemetry from Jorin's exosuit during his final fateful dive, the moment of his critical exposure. The numbers scrolled past, a litany of failure. Hull integrity of the suit, breached. Ambient pressure, spike. External bioparticulate count, off the charts. Neural feedback readings. Praxilla froze. The neural readings. During the exposure, his brainwave patterns, monitored through the suit's rudimentary interface, had become chaotic, nonsensical. But laced within the noise was another pattern. Faint, rhythmic, coherent. It wasn't his. It was something else, pulsing in time with the city's own deep-frequency vibrations. The medical officer had flagged it as sensor ghosting, an equipment malfunction. Praxilla knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that it was not. The fortress of her logic did not crumble. It simply revealed a hidden, terrifying new wing. The choral echo was not a simple mind killer. It did not just cause hallucinations of drowned daughters. It archived, it communicated. The organism that lived in the bones of the city, that thrived on the pressure and the cold, was sharing its knowledge. Jorin wasn't a prophet, he was a receiver. the impossible prescience of Grendel's raids, the heroic intuition. It wasn't Jorin's, it was the city itself, whispering its weaknesses into the mind of a man it had infected. Patient Zero was no longer just a source of contagion. He was an oracle for the abyss, a living, breathing security breach, more dangerous than any saboteur. Praxilivar stood straight, the cold light of the display glinting in her eyes, reflecting a map of her own dawning, methodical horror. The enemy wasn't just in the water. It was in a man's head, and that man was being used as a weapon by the Sump's most dangerous criminal. She turned, her face a mask of iron. She activated the primary comms channel, her voice devoid of any emotion but absolute resolve. Analyst Kalen, disregard previous directives. Initiate Protocol Scylla Subprime. I want every surveillance drone we have left in the Sump activated. Run pattern recognition on all crowds. I'm not looking for Jorin's face. I am looking for a ghost. I want to see where the chaos gathers. I want to know who the desperate and the lost are listening to. Find the new center of gravity in that rust-rotted pit. And bring me its prophet. The air in the comms relay was thick enough to swallow. It tasted of ozone from the jury-rigged power converter and the damp metallic tang of rust that was the city's permanent breath. A single sodium vapor lamp, caged in wire mesh, cast a sickly orange glow over the tangled nest of fiber-optic cables Jorin sat amongst. He was a ghost in the machine, but the machine was a corpse, and its ghosts were restless. The stolen headset clamped over his ears, but the noise it was meant to block was already inside him. He kept his eyes squeezed shut. It helped. It narrowed the world to the deep, resonant thrum of amphitrite, a symphony of decay he was learning to conduct. He wasn't hearing with his ears, not anymore. He was listening with the marrow of his bones, with the strange foreign static that now lived behind his eyes. The choral echo. It connected him to the steel and the strain, the pressure and the pain. He could feel the maintenance conduit, P12, a full sector away, as if it were his own artery. A sharp crackle of static. Grendel's voice, rough as unpolished iron, sliced through the humming chaos in his head. Jorin, talk to me. Deep and safe. We're at the junction, but it's a wall of steel. I see 3 primary access paddles. Which one isn't wired to every alarm in the Sump? Jorin drew a shaky breath, the recycled air feeling thin and useless. He pushed aside the distracting whispers, the sound of a woman weeping 3 levels down, the rhythmic clank of a pump jack nearing its breaking point, the phantom giggle of his daughter Ilara, a sound that was now laced with the chilling timbre of the abyss. Focus. He had to focus. He sent his awareness down the cold, dark length of the conduit. He felt the immense weight of the water above it, the ceaseless vibration of the geothermal turbines below. The metal wasn't silent. It sang a song of stress. Each panel had its own pitch, its own unique groan.
"Not the main panels," Jorin breathed into the mic, his voice a dry rasp. They scream. The sensors are integrated into the locking mechanisms. Go left, about 4 paces. Left is a coolant line, Grendel's voice returned, impatient. There's nothing here but a service plate on the floor. The floor plate, yes. Jorin's fingers dug into the rubber casing of a thick cable beside him, grounding himself. It's colder than the others. The weld is old stock alloy, brittle. Another voice crackled over the comms. KL,
Grendel second. Rust rot, Grendel. He's having us chase floor temperatures. Let me just cut the panel. I can bypass the... Quiet, Grendel snapped. Then softer to Jorin. Keep talking, Ghost. Why the floor plate? Jorin felt a fresh wave of psychic noise crash against him, a flash of memory, not his own. The panic of a man trapped in a flooding compartment, the taste of salt water filling his lungs, the sight of his own hand scrabbling uselessly at a sealed hatch. He winced, a muscle in his jaw twitching violently. He pushed it down, buried it. Underneath it, he stammered, fighting to keep his voice steady. There's a utility void. The feed loop for the pressure sensors on the main panels. It runs through there. The casing is frayed, degraded, from a coolant leak years ago. The system reads it as a static, a ghost signal. It won't register a localized breach for at least 12 seconds. The silence on the comms was absolute, save for the low hum. Jorin could feel Grendel's crew standing still, could almost feel the heat of their skepticism warring with their desperation. Finally, Grendel spoke. 12 seconds. You hear that, KL? You've got 12 seconds. Get the plasma cutter ready. Move like a drifter's shadow. The roar of the plasma cutter was a distant, angry hiss over the comms, but in Jorin's head it was a searing shriek of metal agony. He felt the cut as a hot line of pain down his own side. He gasped, curling in on himself. The sensory bleed was getting worse. The conduit's pain was his pain. The fear of Grendel's crew was a cold knot in his own stomach.
He could hear their strained breathing, the soft clink of their tools. He could also hear the pressure shifting in the water outside the conduit, a subtle change that meant a patrol drone was passing 200 meters away. He heard the flicker of a failing neon sign in a hab block a kilometer distant. He heard the whisper of a pre-inundation lullaby, a memory from a mind that had dissolved into the echo decades ago. "Don't let me drown, Daddy," Ilara's voice. No, not her voice. Her memory, warped and echoed, a lure crafted by the parasite from his own grief. "Jorin, you still with us?" Grendel's voice was tense. It's working," Jorin whispered, his body trembling. "The system is blind, but you have to be fast. The pressure differential will trigger a cascade alarm soon." "We're in," Kale's voice announced, breathless. "God's up the deep. It's all here. Medkits, protein paste, real water filters, a whole crate." Jorin could feel the shift in the crew's collective emotion, from tense fear to avaricious relief. The feeling was a drug, intoxicating and sharp. It flooded him, momentarily drowning out the other whispers. "Grab what you can carry," Grendel commanded. "Filters first, then the meds. Forget the paste. We move in 30 seconds. The sounds of their hurried work filled the comms. For Jorin, the success was a spike of adrenaline, followed by an immediate terrifying collapse. The fragile wall he had built in his mind to hold back the ocean of noise crumbled. The focus he'd been holding on to, the anchor point of conduit P12, was gone. Everything came rushing in at once. The groaning of the entire Sump district, 1,000 stressed beams and bulkheads crying out in unison. The collective, rising panic of thousands of trapped souls, a psychic roar of fear and hunger and claustrophobia. The cold, dispassionate hum of the choral echo, observing, archiving, spreading. And beneath it all, the endless drowning chorus of the dead. He cried out, a choked guttural sound, and tore the headset from his ears. He threw it across the small room, where it hit the wall with a crack of plastic. It made no difference. The sound wasn't in the headset. It was in his blood, in his soul. "Get out!" he screamed.
though no one could hear him. He scrambled backwards, away from the comms unit, pressing himself into the corner of the relay, wrapping his arms around his head. The promised medical supplies and water filters felt like a meaningless prize, a bandage for a man who was already dissolving. The shivering started, a deep, bone-rattling cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the after-image of the raid was burned onto his vision. A schematic of the conduit, glowing with stress points, overlaid with the face of a dying man he'd never met. The raid was a success, but the cost was a piece of himself, scraped away and replaced with the terror of a stranger. He was winning battles for Grendel, but losing the war for his own mind. Silence in the spire was a manufactured commodity, and the Compliance Division Command Center was its primary refinery. Here, 70 levels above the festering damp of the Sump, the groan of stressed metal was an abstract data point, not a visceral bone-deep thrum. The air, scrubbed of ozone and brine, tasted of nothing. It was the perfect environment for pure thought. Praxilla Var stood before the main hollow table, a shimmering blue projection of Amphitrite suspended in the air before her. Her reflections stared back from the polished obsidian floor, a crisp, gray-uniformed ghost. The Sump, the city's foundation and its festering wound, was highlighted in a sickly orange quarantine schematic. Tiny crimson icons flared within its borders, reports of violence, unsanctioned gatherings, system malfunctions, chaos. She watched it all with a detached interest of a biologist observing a petri dish. The whole is the whole. The city's first and only commandment was not a philosophy to Praxilla, it was a physical law, as immutable as pressure and temperature. A diseased cell must be isolated. A failing component must be excised. Sentiment was a rust-rot of the mind. A junior officer approached, his boots making no sound on the sound-dampening floor. He held out a data pad, his movements precise, rehearsed. "Mom, the after-action report on the Tide Lord raid. Conduit P12. Praxilla didn't look at him. She took the datapad, her eyes still fixed on the chaotic bloom of red icons in the quarantine district. Summarize.
Grendel Brekker's crew, the officer said, his voice a flat monotone. They breached a tertiary lubricant conduit, siphoned approximately 200 liters. Asset denial team engaged. 3 Tide Lords neutralized, the rest dispersed into the Sump. Standard black market operation. Nothing is standard anymore, officer. Praxilla's fingers traced the cool glass of the datapad. She scanned the report. Numbers, vectors, munitions expended. All clean, all expected. Except for one detail. Conduit P12. The designation was unfamiliar. She turned to her personal console, the holotable shrinking to a sidebar on her screen. Her fingers danced across the holographic interface, the soft clicks, the only sound in the immediate vicinity. She pulled up the full engineering schematics for the lower maintenance sectors. A lattice of pipes and wires filled the screen, a circulatory system of metal and polymers. She isolated conduit P12. It was a minor line, feeding high-pressure lubricant to the servo mechanisms of a redundant pressure gate. Important, but not critical. She cross-referenced it with the latest structural integrity reports from engineering. Nothing. No alerts. No elevated stress readings. The conduit was operating within nominal parameters.
Praxilla's expression did not change, but a cold stillness settled in her gut. She pulled up the long-range maintenance schedule. Her finger traced down the list of upcoming work orders. There it was, Conduit P12, flagged for preemptive reinforcement in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. The sensors, the most sophisticated instruments in Amphitrite, saw no immediate danger. The engineers, in their obsessive predictive modeling, saw a potential problem nearly a month away. But Grendel Brekker, a common thug who profited from decay, had known to strike it now. He didn't just hit a weak point, he hit a weak point that no one, not even her, knew was weak yet. It wasn't luck. Praxilla leaned back in her chair, the synthetic leather sighing softly. She steepled her fingers, her gaze fixed on the schematic. Brekker was a scavenger, not a prophet. He didn't predict faults, he exploited them after they became obvious. He was a variable, but a predictable one. This was something else. This was an unacceptable variable. The pieces clicked into place with the chilling finality of a pressure door slamming shut. The welder, Jorin, the man who had instinctively known which section of pipe was about to burst in the Sump market. The man designated patient 0, the primary vector for the coral echo pathogen. The fugitive currently being sheltered by Grendel Brekker. She had assumed Brekker was hiding him out of some misguided loyalty or as a bargaining chip. She had been wrong. So terribly, logically wrong. Brekker wasn't sheltering a patient, he was leveraging an asset. The suspicion she had harbored, a cold, hard kernel of a thought, now bloomed into absolute terrifying certainty. The coral echo was not just a psychological contagion. It didn't just create ghosts and echoes of the drowned. The parasite had integrated with its host, and through its host, it was integrating with the city itself. The city's bones were becoming its bones. Jorin wasn't just hearing the voices of the dead, he was hearing the groans of the hull. He was feeling the micro-fractions in the pipes, the strain on the bolts, the metal fatigue in the joints, long before her sensors could register the vibrations. The infection hadn't just given him access to the memories of the dead. It had given him sensory access to the entire dying structure of Amphitrite. He wasn't a man hiding in the Sump. He was a ghost in the machine. Her machine. And Grendel was using him. Using this preternatural knowledge to conduct raids that were surgical in their precision, striking at the city's newly formed vulnerabilities for maximum profit and disruption. The Sump wasn't a shield for Jorin. It was his command center. The thousands of trapped, desperate souls weren't just collateral damage in her quarantine. They were his camouflage. Praxilla stood up, walking back to the hollow table. She expanded the view of the Sump, the crimson alerts flickering like a fever. Conventional methods were failing. Her containment had been a response to a biological threat, predicated on the idea of isolating a pathogen. But she wasn't fighting a pathogen. She was fighting an enemy intelligence that wore a human face and used the city's own body as its weapon and shield.
How do you surgically extract a single man from a district of 10,000 when he can feel the pressure changes caused by your troop movements? How do you corner a target who knows which ventilation duct will collapse before you send a drone through it? You can't.
The logic was as clear and cold as the abyss. Precision was impossible. The entire district was compromised. The tumor and the surrounding tissue were now indistinguishable. Her jaw tightened. The shift in her mind was absolute. This was no longer a manhunt. It was a sterilization. The variable had to be eliminated. But if her hunters couldn't find him, if his new senses made him impossible to corner, then she would have to turn the entire petri dish against him. She looked at the chaos of the Sump, at the flickering icons of desperation and fear. They were a liability, a shield for her enemy, but they could be something else. They could be a weapon. Praxilla turned to her communications officer. Her voice was devoid of all emotion, as clean and sterile as the air she breathed. "Patch me into the leaflet drone network. Sump deployment only." The officer blinked. "Ma'am, what are the contents of the message?" Praxilla's eyes were fixed on the glowing orange schematic, on the cancer at the heart of her city. "A bounty," she said softly. "A generous one, payable in clean water, jewel chits, and relocation warrants to mid-spire sectors, for the delivery of the fugitive Jorin, or the mystic Hestian, or anyone displaying advanced symptoms. Make the offer to everyone. Turn every desperate, rust-rotted hull-clinger down there into a hunter. If I can't find the weapon, I'll make his shield devour him." The quiet was a lie. Jorin knew it, felt it in the hollow space behind his ribs where the city's endless groan used to live. Here, in the forgotten maintenance crawlspace, Grendel had offered a sanctuary. The thrum was muffled. It was a low, sleeping pulse instead of a constant scream. Condensation dripped from insulated pipes overhead, each drop a percussive beat in the suffocating stillness. The air, thick with the scent of ozone and Grendel's hoarded glimmer moss, clung to his lungs. For the first time since the bulkhead slammed shut, he could almost think.
He sat on a rusted toolkit, his back against the cold, weeping bulkhead. A single jury-rigged sodium lamp cast a sickly orange glow, making the shadows writhe. At his feet lay one of the spoils from Grendel's raids, a sterile-sealed medical kit, its plastic wrap crinkling under his boot. It was Spire-born tech, clean and white, an alien artifact in the grime of the Sump. He'd nicked his hand during the food riot, a shallow gash on his palm. A stupid injury. A reminder. He peeled open the medkit. Inside, nestled in molded foam, were synth-skin applicators, antiseptic wipes, and a tiny injector of broad-spectrum antibiotics. The logo on the antiseptic wipes foil packet caught his eye. A stylized starburst with the brand name Oraclean, a Spire brand, for Spire children's scraped knees. He stared at the logo. The orange light of the crawlspace seemed to dim, the rhythmic drip fading into a distant echo. The metallic tang in the air was gone, replaced by something impossible. The scent of clean laundry and warm, dry air. He wasn't in the crawlspace anymore. He was standing in a room. The light was soft and even, a perfect mimicry of late afternoon sun filtering through a high window. The walls were a pale, calming blue. There were no exposed pipes, no rust stains, no tangles of cable snaking along the floor. A bed, small and neatly made, was tucked into a corner. On the wall above it, a projection screen displayed a slow-motion video of surface-world clouds drifting across a sapphire sky. A fantasy. A small girl was in the bed, no older than 5, with dark curls spilling over a pillow that looked impossibly soft. She wasn't Ilara. Her face was rounder,
her eyes a different shade of brown. But the way she looked at him, he felt a surge of love so powerful it stole his breath. It was clean, uncomplicated, a pure, bright warmth that had nothing to do with geothermal vents or nutrient paste. It was an emotion he distantly remembered feeling. But this was different. This had no jagged edges of guilt, no undercurrent of fear. It was just love, perfect and whole. The hand reached out and smoothed the curls from the girl's forehead. The skin was warm, the hair soft as spun silk. He could feel the fine bones of her skull beneath his palm. "Sleep tight, little star," a voice said. The voice was his, but the words were not. The sentiment, however, flooded him completely. He felt the rumble in his chest as he spoke, the slight smile that formed on his lips. He watched the girl's eyes flutter closed, her breathing evening out into the soft rhythm of sleep. He pulled the blanket up to her chin. The fabric was a smooth, woven material, not the coarse, recycled fiber of Sump bedding. He felt the paternal instinct to check the room one last time, lock the door, ensure the temperature was stable. A wave of profound peace washed over him. She was safe. She was warm. All was right. The peace shattered. The smell of rust and ozone slammed back into him. The cold of the bulkhead seeped through his coveralls. The drip, drip, drip of condensation hammered at his skull. He was on the floor of the crawl space, the medkit spilled beside him. His heart was a trip hammer in his chest, and a cold sweat slicked his skin. The gash on his palm throbbed, a dull, angry pulse. The hallucination was gone, but the feeling, the alien feeling of that perfect, paternal love, it lingered like a phantom limb. It was a warmth that felt like a brand, a foreign body inside his soul. He'd had the echoes before, the screams of the drowning, the panic of a hull breach, the cold resignation of a failing rebreather. He understood those. They were the native language of the abyss. He shared their terror, their final moments. But this was worse. This was an invasion of a different kind. He scrambled back, away from the medkit, as if it were a venomous vent crawler. The Aura Clean logo seemed to mock him. A memory from the man who packed this kit? The technician who sealed it? Who had a daughter with dark curls in a warm, quiet room in the spire? He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to summon the memory of Ilara. He needed her face. He needed the specific, agonizing weight of his grief for her. It was his anchor. It was the last thing that was truly his. He saw her in the churning water of the breached residential pod. He saw her small hand slipping from his grasp. He felt the familiar, crushing guilt, the memory that had replayed in his mind 1,000,000 times, a penance he paid every waking moment. But this time, it was tainted.
Underneath his own grief, a new layer had been added. The pure, uncomplicated love for the other child, the stranger's child, was there. A smooth, polished stone beneath the jagged shards of his own pain. He tried to feel the raw agony of Ilara's loss, but the borrowed peace was there, dulling the edge. It was like trying to taste real water after a lifetime of recycled brine.
The memory of the pure thing corrupted the taste of what was left. He felt a wave of nausea. The choral echo hadn't just shown him someone else's death. It had shown him their life. It had given him their love. And in doing so, it was stealing his. His grief was being diluted, overwritten by a stranger's gentle, happy memory. "Rust rot. No, no," he mumbled, clutching his head. "She's mine. The pain is mine." He was losing the one thing he thought was immutable, his own suffering. The memories of the drowned were a burden, but this was a dissolution. If his guilt for Alara wasn't even his own anymore, then what was left of Jorin? What was he if not the man who failed to save his daughter? The question echoed in the sudden, terrifying silence of his own mind, a silence where the edges of his identity were fraying, dissolving into the memories of 1,000 other ghosts. The air in the Triarch Council chamber was so clean it felt sharp in Praxilla's lungs, a sterile counterpoint to the images of decay she had projected onto the immense obsidian wall. The simulated daylight, a perfect, soft gold, spilled from the dome above, illuminating the 3 figures seated before her at a crescent-shaped table of brushed steel. From here, one could almost forget the 7 kilometers of crushing ocean overhead. Almost. On the wall, a holographic map of Amphitrite pulsed. The lower third, the Sump, was a spider web of angry red nodes, infection clusters, structural stress points, energy consumption spikes that corresponded to nothing but chaos. "The data is unequivocal," Praxilla said, her voice steady, each word a carefully placed stone in the foundation of her argument. The chamber's acoustics carried her voice without amplification, a cold, clear bell. Over the last 3 cycles, since the initial breach at the taps, choral echo biosignatures in the Sump have increased by 900%. Our deep-level filtration systems are at maximum capacity, and still, trace elements have been confirmed in the primary reclamation tanks.
Lyra, head of sustenance, a woman whose face was permanently etched with the worry of feeding 1,000,000 mouths, flinched as if struck. Kalen, the burly head of engineering, just scowled, his massive hands clasped on the steel tabletop. Praxilla gestured, and the display shifted. It showed maintenance logs, schematics of conduits and pressure regulators. Red alerts flared over a dozen recent events. These are not random equipment failures. They are targeted, precise. A pressure regulator for a residential block's nutrient line, bypassed. A secondary water pump, overloaded. A junction in the Whispering Gills deliberately fractured to aerosolize unfiltered water. The sabotage correlates perfectly with the infection spikes. One feeds the other. The parasite creates chaos, and the chaos spreads the parasite. She let that hang in the soundproofed silence. The only noise was the phantom near subsonic thrum of the geothermal turbines, a vibration felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. It was the city's heartbeat, a heartbeat she was here to regulate. "The Sump is compromised," she stated. It was not an opinion, it was a diagnosis. The infection has taken root not just in the population, but in their behavior. It has become a self-perpetuating system of decay. Every joule chit we spend on repairs, every liter of clean water we pump down there, we are merely feeding the tumor. Kalen's knuckles were white. "Get to the point, Praxilla. What is your recommendation?" Praxilla met his gaze. She had anticipated his bluntness, his engineering-driven impatience. She took a deliberate breath. My recommendation is not a repair. It is a surgery. I am formally proposing we invoke the Hull Integrity Act, Section 4, Total District Sequestration. I am proposing we seal the Sump. The silence that followed was a physical thing, heavier than water. Lyra's mouth opened, but no sound came out. John, the arbiter, the man who represented the cold calculus of governance, leaned back, his expression unreadable. It was Kalen who finally broke it, a harsh, guttural sound that was almost a laugh. You can't be serious. I have never been more so, Praxilla replied, her own posture rigid, unyielding.
Seal the Sump, Kalen's voice rose, losing its measured tone and gaining the grating shriek of stressed metal. Amputation, you called it. Do you have any idea what that means? We're not talking about closing a corridor. We're talking about 6 primary pressure bulkheads, 17 access conduits, the main circulatory trunk of the lower city. The shift in internal pressure dynamics alone could create a sympathetic resonance cascade that would crack this arcology in half from the foundations up. My team has run the simulations, Praxilla countered coolly. The risk of catastrophic failure is 17%. Manageable. Manageable? Manageable? A 1 in 5 chance of killing everyone is manageable to you. He slammed his hand on the table, and the sound was like a gunshot in the sterile room. And what about the people? There are over 50,000 hull clingers down there, Praxilla. Welders, technicians, their families. Your surgery is a death sentence. A quarantine is not a sentence. It is a preventative measure, she said, her voice becoming robotic as she fell back on the catechism of her office. Don't you dare hide behind protocol, Lyra finally found her voice, high and trembling with outrage. You would cut off their power, their water, their air recirculation. You would leave 50,000 people to either starve, suffocate, or be consumed by this echo. It is monstrous. Praxilla felt a familiar flicker of irritation. Sentiment, the fatal flaw of the old order. They saw 50,000 individuals. She saw a single infected wound threatening the entire body. The hull is the whole. It was the first thing she was taught, the only thing that mattered. Why couldn't they see it? What is monstrous, she said, her voice dropping, forcing them to lean in, is allowing this infection to reach the mid-levels, to reach the spire. My report showed the Sump is no longer just a district. It is the parasite's primary vector. It is a breeding ground, and it is actively attacking us. The choice is not between saving the Sump and abandoning it. The choice is between sacrificing one district or losing the entire city.
She looked from Lyra's horrified face to Kalen's mask of fury. The trace elements found in the reclamation tanks, they were downstream from the intake valves that service this level, the atrium. She let her eyes drift up toward the shimmering dome. It is a matter of time before the water you drink, the air you breathe, carries the echo. How long will you debate the morality of amputation when the gangrene is climbing your own leg? Jean, the arbiter, finally spoke, his voice smooth as the polished floor. The precedent, Chief Officer. We seal the Sump today. What happens when we see an infection spike in Aquaculture Sector B, or the habitation rings? Where does it stop? This act would grant compliance unprecedented authority. It would shatter the social contract. The social contract is void if there's no one left alive to honor it, Praxilla retorted instantly. The hull is the whole. That is the only contract that matters. Everything else is a luxury we can no longer afford. She watched them, the 3 architects of a society that believed in balance, in humanity, in hope. They were good people, and they were going to get everyone killed. Kalen stood up, his large frame casting a long shadow in the artificial sun. This is a power grab, Praxilla. You're using this crisis to turn compliance into the city's absolute authority. I am using this crisis to save the city from your inaction, she shot back, her control finally cracking, a sliver of her own righteous fury showing through. You want to form committees, run more studies, hope for a miracle. But there are no miracles in the abyss. There is only pressure and a choice. She raised her hand, and with a flick of her wrist, the horrifying, data-rich holograms vanished. The obsidian wall went black, reflecting the placid, sunlit room back at them. The illusion of safety returned, fragile and obscene. Praxilla turned to leave, her boots clicking with sharp finality on the floor. The parasite doesn't debate, she said, pausing at the threshold, her back to them. It spreads. The choice is yours, a controlled amputation before the next cycle, or a city-wide rot that will drown us all in silence. She didn't wait for an answer. She stepped out of the chamber, leaving the three most powerful people in Amphitrite to stare at their own reflections in the dark, empty wall.
The grated floor of the service conduit vibrated, a low, constant thrum that Jorin felt in his teeth. It was a familiar sensation, the city's grinding heartbeat, but now it was overlaid with a new sound, a low murmur of human voices, thick with desperation. The air, usually a sterile mix of ozone and rust, was heavy with the scent of unwashed bodies and fear. Jorin pulled the rough-spun hood of his borrowed jacket lower, shadowing a face he no longer felt was entirely his own. "Almost there," Grendel Brekker said, his voice a low rumble that barely rose above the drone. The Tide Lord moved with a confident rolling gait, his bulk filling the narrow passage. "Wanted you to see this for yourself, see what your gift is accomplishing." Jorin didn't answer. Gift. Grendel called it a gift. Jorin called it a cancer. The choral echo was a constant static in his skull, a chorus of drowning gasps and final panicked thoughts. And now, since the Sump had been sealed, it fed on the collective terror of thousands, a psychic feast that left him perpetually on the edge of screaming. He was a weapon, a divine rod Grendel used to find weaknesses in Amphitrite's arteries, locating sealed-off caches of supplies to plunder. He was a tool, nothing more. They stopped at a heavy mesh vent. Grendel produced a pry bar and worked a corner loose. "After you," he grunted, holding it open. Jorin slipped through into darkness, landing softly on a maintenance catwalk. Below him, a cavernous, forgotten cistern opened up. It must have been a water processing hub once. Massive, inert filter stacks stood like silent, skeletal giants. Now its floor was a sea of people, sickly orange work lamps, jury-rigged to exposed power conduits, cast long, dancing shadows. The crowd was packed, shoulder to shoulder, their faces pale and gaunt. Grendel's Tide Lords, easily identified by their matching armbands and salvaged stun batons, stood at the perimeter, their presence a thin veneer of order over a deep well of chaos. They'd set up 3 distribution points along the far wall. "Behold," Grendel said, sweeping a hand out as he joined Jorin on the catwalk, "the Sump's first real social program."
Jorin's eyes traced the lines. The longest was for water, the second for nutrient paste. The third, much shorter, was for basic med supplies. He recognized the cylindrical paste containers and the sterile blue packaging of the medkits. He'd seen them in his mind's eye before he'd ever laid his physical ones on them.
his parasite-given intuition leading Grendel's crew through a maze of pressure-locked corridors to a forgotten quartermaster's locker. He'd helped steal this hope. The thought left a taste like rust in his mouth. The echo hummed, feeding him the crowd's emotions. Not gratitude, not hope, just a raw animal need. The gnawing ache of an empty stomach, the burning thirst of a dry throat, the quiet panic of a mother looking at her feverish child. He felt it all, 1,000 pinpricks against his sanity. This wasn't helping. This was Grendel building an empire on the back of a plague. "Don't look so grim," Grendel said, leaning on the railing beside him. "Priscilla and her masters in the spire sealed us in here to die. They cut the water, the food, the power. They think of us as a diseased limb to be amputated. But a limb can learn to feed itself." He gestured to the crowd. "They're scared, they're hungry, but they're alive. Because of us, because of you, Jorin." "You're profiting from it," Jorin said, his voice flat and hoarse. Grendel chuckled, a low, gravelly sound. "Profit, power, survival. They're all the same word down here. The council deals in jewel chits. I deal in loyalty. In the end, my currency is worth more. Walk with me." He led Jorin along the catwalk, toward the distribution point for water. The metallic clank of canisters and the slosh of liquid was the loudest sound in the chamber. As they got closer, Jorin saw it. A gleaming silver cylinder, a high-capacity emergency water purifier, one of 3 he'd located in a sealed maintenance bay near the outer hall, a place forgotten since the last major refit. Grendel's men had one hooked up, a thin hose dispensing a steady, clear stream.
His eyes caught on a woman near the front of the line. She was holding the hand of a little girl, no older than 6. The child's face was smudged with grime, her hair lank and plastered to her forehead with sweat. She held a dented metal cup in both hands, her knuckles white with effort. When their turn came, the woman guided the cup under the hose. A tidal lord filled it to the brim. The girl didn't wait. She lifted the cup to her lips, tilting her head back, and drank. She drank with a desperate, all-consuming thirst, water spilling from the corners of her mouth and down her chin. When she was done, she let out a long, shuddering breath, her eyes closed in a moment of pure, unadulterated relief. It was the first clean, untainted water she'd had in days, not the recycled, echo-laced slurry dripping from the taps. The sight struck Jorin with the force of a physical blow. The noise in his head, the static, the whispers, the panic vanished. In the sudden, profound silence, the girl's face flickered. For a terrifying half-second, it wasn't her. It was Leela. His Leela. Her pigtails, the small gap between her front teeth. The memory wasn't his own. It was corrupted, rebuilt by the echo from the universal template of a father's love and loss. The crushing weight of his failure with Leela collided with this one tiny, vicarious success. He had saved this child from the poison in the water. For a day. For an hour. He stumbled back from the railing, his breath catching in his throat. Grendel was watching him, his eyes sharp and calculating. He stepped closer, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Look at that, Jorin. That's real. Not a promise from the spire, not a prayer to the abyss. That's a cup of clean water. You did that." Jorin shook his head, the denial a reflex. "You're using me." "Of course I am," Grendel said without a hint of apology. "And you're using me for shelter. This is the Sump, not the spire atrium. There are no clean hands down here." He jabbed a thick finger toward the girl, who was now leaning her head against her mother's leg, a faint smile on her face.
but look me in the eye and tell me she gives a single rust rot about my motives. Tell me what you're feeling right now is worse than letting her drink the filth from the pipes."
Jorin couldn't. He couldn't look at Grendel. He looked back at the crowd, at the tired, desperate faces, now tinged with a flicker of something other than despair. The bitter cynicism was still there, a poison in his own heart. But beneath it, a terrible new weight was settling. Not guilt, not shame, responsibility. It was a monstrous, twisted purpose. He was no hero. He was the enabler of a warlord, a bloodhound for a pirate king. But his monstrosity was keeping these people alive. The static began to creep back into his head, but it was different now. Quieter, as if waiting for orders. "There's a critical pump junction," Jorin said, his voice hollow. He didn't look at Grendel. "Sector GAMMA 9. It regulates nutrient paste flow to a mid-level processing plant. Praxilla's goons won't be guarding it. They think it's offline for a maintenance cycle." Grendel's lips pulled back in a slow, triumphant smile. He clapped a heavy hand on Jorin's shoulder, a gesture that was both an affirmation and a claim of ownership. "Deep and safe, Jorin," the Tidal Lord rumbled. "Deep and safe." Jorin just stared into the sea of faces below, seeing 1,000 new ghosts he was now cursed to keep alive. The Triarch Council Chamber was a space designed to deny the existence of pressure. High in the spire, its obsidian floor reflected the ghostly blue twilight filtering down through the dome, an illusion of open sky in a world that had none. Here the constant groan of the hull was engineered into a subsonic memory, a barely felt thrum in the bones. Yet today, the pressure was back, coiling in the sterile ozonic air, emanating from the woman who stood opposite Chief Engineer Kalen. "The models are unequivocal," Kalen said, his voice tight. He gestured at the hologram shimmering above the center of the table, a three-dimensional, wire-framed ghost of Amphitrite itself. "Isolating the Sump is not like closing a door. It's like breaking a bone to set a thiever."
His finger traced a path through the light. A cascade of angry red lines bloomed on the hologram, spiderwebbing up from the city's foundation. "If you initiate the full quarantine protocol, slamming the primary pressure bulkheads on levels 40 through 45, you sever the main load-bearing connections between the Sump's integrated habitat blocks and the central spire. The resonant frequency of the lower hull will shift." He tapped a button on his console. A low, ominous hum filled the chamber as the simulation ran. The red lines pulsed violently. "The tremor tides are already putting us at 17% above projected stress tolerance. Your amputation, as you call it, will create sympathetic resonance along the primary conduits. The vibrations will amplify. It will shake the city apart from the bottom up." He looked from the terrifying simulation to the two other faces of the Triarch Council. Administrator Eris, the sustenance chief, looked pale, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. Her focus was on the biological threat, the parts per billion of choral echo her senses were screaming about in the water reclamation tanks. She was terrified. But Kalen could see the engineer's logic was giving her pause. Then there was Praxilla Var, Chief of Compliance. She watched the hologram of her city tearing itself to pieces with the flat, emotionless calm of someone watching a weather forecast.
Her severe black uniform was a slash of darkness against the brushed steel wall behind her. She hadn't moved. She hadn't blinked. "Your models are elegant, Kalen," she said, her voice as cool and clean as the chamber's recycled air. "They are also irrelevant." Kalen felt a flush of heat rise up his neck. Irrelevant? Administrator, these are the same structural integrity models that have kept this city from imploding for 78 years. They are based on the immutable laws of physics. Physics are not the only laws we are subject to anymore, Praxilla countered, taking a single, deliberate step toward the table. The hologram's light played across her sharp features, making her eyes seem like dark pits. Your models account for metal fatigue, for water pressure, for seismic activity. They are built to measure the strain on a machine. They do not and cannot account for a sentient contaminant that is actively trying to break the machine from within. Eris shifted uncomfortably. Praxilla, what Kalen is suggesting, a precision quarantine, team-by-team extraction of the infected, it's more surgical. You cannot be surgical with a flood, Praxilla snapped, her gaze never leaving Kalen. The echo is not a series of isolated infections. It's a consciousness. It shares information. Every Sump dweller breathing the unfiltered air, drinking from a compromised tap. They are becoming outposts for it. Your precision quarantine would be like trying to catch the ocean in a net. While we dither, it is climbing the pipes. It is in the water Eris's own department is supposed to be purifying. The hull is the whole, is it not? How can the whole survive when its very bloodstream is poisoned? We're talking about sealing thousands of people in their own tombs. Kalen's voice rose, the professional decorum shattering. Hull cleaners, technicians, families, the very people who keep this city breathing. You'd sacrifice them on an assumption? I would sacrifice a limb to save the body. It is a calculation you seem incapable of making. Perhaps your time in the Sump has fostered a certain sentimentality. The accusation hung in the silent room. Sentimentality. In Amphitrite, it was a word akin to treason. It meant you prioritized the part over the whole. It meant you were a weak link. Kalen's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He could feel the city's deep thrum under his feet, a vibration he had spent his life interpreting. It was a living thing to him, and what she proposed was murder. This isn't sentimentality, Praxilla. It's mathematics. The Sump's pressure regulators are not optional. They are integrated. They actively balance the load across the entire foundation. Sealing them isn't cutting off a limb, it's collapsing a lung. He jabbed the console again, bringing up a new projection. A swirling, chaotic map of vent access, maintenance shafts, and decommissioned conduits. We can go in. We have exosuits. We can establish a clean zone, filter the air and water locally, and begin evacuations. It will be difficult, it will be dangerous, but it won't crack the foundation.
Praxilla let out a sound that was almost a laugh, but it was utterly devoid of humor. A dry, metallic click. You would send our most valuable personnel into the heart of the infection. You would risk the pilots, the suits, the soldiers. You would open a pathway for it to escape. Your plan is sentiment. It is the hope that you can save everyone. Hope is a luxury we lost when the oceans rose. She looked at Eris, her eyes blazing with a zealot's fire. The chief engineer offers a complex, high-risk, low-certainty plan that gambles the entire city on the hope we can outmaneuver a biological intelligence. I offer a single, clean, absolute action. The Sump is compromised. The infection is spreading. We know Patient Zero, the welder Jorin, is down there, a super spreader who is already a nexus for the Echo. We cut the connection. We cauterize the wound. We let the infection burn itself out in the prison we create for it. Burn itself out, rust-rot Praxilla. They will drown in it. They will tear each other apart in the dark. Kalen yelled, slamming his hand on the obsidian table. The hologram flickered. Praxilla didn't even flinch. Then they will die for Amphitrite, a noble, necessary sacrifice. Their deaths will purchase the survival of everyone else in this city. It is the purest expression of the hull is the whole that I can imagine. Kalen stared at her, a cold dread washing over him that had nothing to do with physics or simulations. He saw it now. This wasn't a debate. It was a proclamation. Her mind was already made up. The pressure paranoia she had stoked for years was now her ultimate weapon. She had the fear of the people, the fear of the council. He looked to Eris, a last desperate appeal. The sustenance chief stared at her hands on the table, refusing to meet his gaze. She was a scientist who dealt with living things, with cycles, with growth and contamination. Praxilla's brutal, simple finality was a siren song to her terror. She was afraid of the monster in the water, and Praxilla was offering her a silver bullet. The alternative, Praxilla said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, a cold, hypnotic sound, is to do nothing. To wait until the Echo is in the spire, in our food, in our children. To wait until the groans of the hull are drowned out by the whispers in our own minds.
That was it, the final blow. She had invoked the ultimate taboo, the deepest fear of every soul in Amphitrite, the loss of self. Eris slowly, reluctantly nodded. Kalen felt the floor drop out from under him. He was no longer a chief engineer. He was just a man watching a death sentence being signed. He turned back to the hologram, to the beautiful, fragile lattice of light that was his home. The red lines of his simulation were no longer a warning. They were a prophecy. He had presented his case with logic and data, and she had defeated him with fear and a ghost story, a true one. And that was the most terrifying part of all. Across the cavernous bay, Grendel Brekker stood like a titan carved from scrap metal and shadow. The Tide Lord was arguing with one of his lieutenants, his voice a low growl that cut through the background hum of desperation. They were inventorying their salvaged assets, dividing spoils before the battle was even over. Grendel saw the quarantine not as a tomb, but as a kingdom in the making. Then it happened. A new sensation sliced through the dull psychic roar. It was not a thought. It was not a sound. It was a feeling, sharp and exquisitely specific, like a nerve in a tooth being exposed to ice. A point of agony, deep in the city's skeleton. It was a phantom limb pain for a body he was only just realizing he possessed. It was miles away, but it radiated through his own bones as if it were happening inside his marrow. He gasped, his eyes flying open. The orange light of the hideout seemed to pulse, to dim for a sickening second. The world reasserted itself. Grendel was still talking. The converter still buzzed, but the pain remained, a single, high, piercing note of failure in the symphony of decay. The sound escaped Jorin's lips, a choked little noise. He pushed himself off the crates, his legs unsteady. The floor, a grated metal platform, felt like it was vibrating with that same agonizing frequency. He stumbled towards the wall he'd been staring at, his hand outstretched, trembling. "Oi!" one of Grendel's guards grunted, shifting his weight. "Stay put, Echo Boy. The boss is busy." Jorin didn't hear him. His world had compressed to the cold, wet surface of the bulkhead. He pressed his palm flat against it. The metal was frigid, slick with the city's constant sweat. Through his palm he felt it, a vibration so fine it was almost imperceptible, a thrum of pure stress. The chorus in his head shifted, the vague panic of the masses momentarily receding, replaced by the specific, physical groan of tortured steel. It was a voice he knew better than his own. His fingers, calloused and sure from a lifetime of welding, traced the seams and rivet patterns. He wasn't just looking. He was palpating the city's skin, searching for the source of the pain. Then he found it. Near the floor, branching off a thick support bolt, was a crack. It was nothing, a hairline fracture in the surface paint, barely a scratch. Anyone else would have dismissed it as a cosmetic flaw, another sign of the Sump's perpetual decay. But Jorin knew. He felt it. This crack wasn't old. It was new. It was a symptom. A sympathetic trauma manifesting in this random sheet of metal, miles from the wound. He could see it in his mind's eye, a schematic of shimmering ghostly light overlaid on reality. A twisting, groaning column of metal deep in a sector he hadn't visited in years. Grendel. The Tidal Lord stopped mid-sentence, turning with predatory annoyance. His face, a road map of scars and suspicion, darkened. "What is it? I told you to be quiet. You're making my men nervous." Jorin staggered back from the wall, pointing at it with a shaking hand. "The wall," he rasped, his throat dry. "It's wrong." One of Grendel's men let out a short, derisive laugh. "Rust rot, he's finally lost it." "Pylon 77 Gamma," Jorin said, the words tumbling out, tasting of copper. He was translating a feeling into a language he barely controlled. "The old hydroponics bay. Sector 4. The primary support collar. It's shearing." Grendel's eyes narrowed. He took a step closer, his bulk eclipsing the orange lamp. "The old hydroponics? That sector's been depressurized for a decade. It's a dead zone. And how in the hell would you know that from staring at my wall?" "Because I can feel it!" Jorin slammed his palm back against the cold steel, the impact echoing flatly in the bay. "This crack, it wasn't here an hour ago. Can't you feel the vibration? The whole frame is screaming. It's a torsion failure. The tremors, they must have weakened it over time, and now it's letting go." He felt a wave of vertigo. The echo wasn't just showing him a schematic, it was pulling him in. For a second he was there. He smelled the stagnant, mineral-heavy water of the abandoned bay. He heard the high-frequency shriek of metal atoms tearing apart. He felt the immense crushing weight of the ocean above, a pressure the pylon was no longer able to defy. "That pylon holds up the floor of Sector 4, he continued, his voice dropping, becoming urgent, certain. "But it's anchored to the foundation right above the primary reclamation reservoir for the lower Sump. When it goes, it won't just collapse the bay. It'll rip a hole straight through the reservoir floor. It'll be a Class 4 breach. Everything below Sector 3, it'll be gone in minutes. A flash flood of unfiltered water." Silence. The distant shouting of the Sump seemed to fade away. Grendel stared at Jorin, his gaze moving from Jorin's wild, desperate eyes to the insignificant crack on the wall, then back again. He saw no madness. He saw the terrifying lucidity of a master craftsman describing a catastrophic failure he was witnessing in real time. This wasn't an echo-touched vision of the dead. This was a live report from the city's nervous system. Grendel was a pragmatist. He dealt in salvage, in weaknesses, in exploiting the crumbling reality of Amphitrite. And in Jorin's frantic warning, he didn't hear psychosis. He heard an opportunity. He didn't waste another breath. He spun on his heel, his voice a bellow that cut through the tension. "Kale! Rorik! You heard him! Full gear! Grab the portable cutters and the seal foam canisters! Move!" His men, startled into action, scrambled for their equipment. Grendel jabbed a thick finger at another of his crew. "Get the comms relay online. I want a channel to every man we have posted between here and Sector 4. I want a perimeter. No one gets in or out. If he's right—" He paused, looking back at Jorin, his expression a chilling fusion of fear and avarice. "If he's right, that reservoir's about to become the most valuable piece of real estate in this whole rust bucket, and we're going to own it." A new kind of dread, cold and sharp, pierced Jorin's heart. He had acted to save lives, to silence a scream he couldn't bear. But in proving his new senses were real, he hadn't just warned a tidal lord. He had armed him.
The last echo died in the obsidian walls of the Triarch Council Chamber. It wasn't the shriek of stressed metal or the thunder of a hull breach. It was worse. It was the sound of a human mind dissolving. A chorus of overlapping whispers, a man's frantic prayer, a woman's weeping, the gurgling gasp of a final breath, all layered into a single cohesive spike of digital static. The recording from the Sump's water reclamation filters, the sound of the choral echo. Silence descended, heavy and absolute, a thing more oppressive than the 4 kilometers of ocean pressing down on the spire atrium above. From her seat at the brushed steel triangular table, Chief Compliance Officer Praxilla watched the silence work. She watched it curdle the faces of her 2 colleagues. Matron Alara of Sustenance, a woman whose soft features were usually a study in placid authority, was now pale, her hand covering her mouth. Her eyes were wide with a simple, useless horror. On the opposite side, Administrator Thorn of Engineering, a man who saw the world as a series of pressure equations, was staring at the blank holoprojector as if he could unsee the audio waveform that had just been displayed there. His knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the table. They were terrified. Good. Fear was a necessary catalyst. Praxilla, however, felt nothing but a cold, clarifying focus. The audio hadn't horrified her. It had confirmed her. For weeks she had presented them with data, trace biomatter, anomalous pressure readings, psychogenic incident reports from the Sump's medbays. They had treated it all as noise, as statistical ghosts. But this was a voice. The voice of the abyss, and it was speaking from inside their own city. She took a slow, deliberate breath of the perfectly filtered, ozone-tinged air, so different from the briny damp of the lower levels. The spire was designed to create an illusion of control, of pristine order. The simulated daylight pouring from the ceiling panels was a warm, pleasant gold, a lie against the eternal crushing black outside. The entire chamber was a monument to the denial she was about to shatter. The fear on their faces was the first crack in the facade. They see a monster, she thought, her gaze flicking from Ilara's trembling lip to Thorn's frozen posture. They hear death. I hear a diagnostic, a symptom that demands a cure. The hull is the whole. Do they even remember what that means? Ilara finally lowered her hand. Her voice was a fragile thing, a thread of sound in the vast silence. "Gods of the deep, Praxilla, what was that?" "That was the entity we have been tracking," Praxilla said, her tone level, devoid of the tremor in Ilara's. "Concentrated recording from filtration tank 7 Gamma, the primary feed from the Sump residential block. It is in their water. It is in their food paste processing units. The infection vector is total." Thorn finally moved, shifting his considerable weight in his high-backed chair. The sound was a dull scrape against the polished floor.
Contamination is one thing, Praxilla. A biological agent we can manage. We can deploy sterilizing agents, increase UV filtration. You are not listening, Praxilla cut him off, her voice sharp as broken glass. This is not a bacterium. Did that sound like a microbe to you, Administrator? It's a mimetic microorganism. It carries memory. It carries consciousness. It is a psychological plague, and your filters are a sieve. Then we warned them, Ilara insisted, a flash of her old fire returning. We issue a boil water advisory. We can't just... What you're suggesting is monstrous. Praxilla felt a spike of pure, unadulterated contempt in this room. They were Spireborn, both of them. They had never tasted nutrient paste that was mostly algae, never had to sleep through the groan of a bulkhead that sounded like it was about to give way. Their fear was abstract, hers was ancestral. Warn them, she repeated, the question hanging in the air like a death sentence. You would incite a mass panic in the most densely populated, structurally volatile section of Amphitrite. You would tell 500,000 souls trapped in a metal can that the water they drink and the air they breathe is haunted? They will tear each other apart. They will tear the hull apart. That is not a warning, matron. That is a trigger. Thorn leaned forward. So what is your alternative? You've presented us with a problem, Chief Officer, not a solution. You want to deploy compliance teams, mass arrests? It's impossible to screen for this fast enough. Screening is irrelevant now, Praxilla said. The Sump is compromised, the entire district. It's a tumor, and when a tumor threatens the life of the whole organism, you do not coddle it.
Ilara gasped. Excise it? You're talking about nearly a third of our population. The welders, the technicians, the farmers, the entire workforce that keeps this city from imploding. They are already lost, Praxilla stated, the words falling like stones. Every moment we debate, the infection burrows deeper into the city's systems. It came from the taps. It lives in the foundation. Now it is in the sump. Next it will be here, in the spire. Do you want to hear those whispers in your own apartments, Administrator? Do you want to taste them in your water, matron? That hit them. She saw it, the flicker of selfish, personal fear, the thought of their own sanitized world being breached. It was the only language they truly understood. They were still hesitating. She could see the cost-benefit analyses running behind Thorn's eyes, the pathetic flicker of human sentiment in Ilara's. They were going to talk, they were going to form a subcommittee, they were going to drown the city in procedure while the abyss drowned it for real. Praxilla stood. The movement was sudden, precise. She placed both palms flat on the cold steel of the table, her shadow falling over the hollow projector. The debate, she decided, was over. You are correct, Administrator Thorn. I did not bring you a proposal to be debated. I brought you a declaration of fact. Your indecision is a greater threat to this arcology than any tremor tide. She straightened to her full height, her severe black uniform a stark slash against the chamber's pale aesthetic. Her voice became formal, resonant with an authority that dwarfed theirs. As Chief Compliance Officer, responsible for the existential integrity of Amphitrite, I hereby unilaterally invoke the Hull Integrity Act, Clause 7. In the event of a cascading structural or biological threat that endangers the integrity of the whole, the Compliance Division is empowered to take any and all measures necessary to isolate, contain, and neutralize said threat
bypassing standard council procedure for the preservation of the command structure. Thorn and Ilara stared, mouths slightly agape. They looked like fish pulled from the water, powerless, suffocating. You can't," Thorn stammered. "That clause is a dead letter, a relic from the founding."
"It has never been rescinded," Praxilla said, her voice like grinding ice. She turned to the central console embedded in the wall, its interface glowing with a serene blue light. Her hands moved over the surface, her authorization codes flowing from her fingertips. She was no longer asking for permission, she was giving orders. And the threat is no longer theoretical. She brought up the schematic of Amphitrite, a shimmering lattice of light. With 3 decisive commands, she highlighted the entire Sump district, from the Whispering Gills to the lowest residential hab clusters. "Executive Order Varar 77 Alpha," she spoke, her voice now amplified by the chamber's comm system, each word a hammer blow. "Effective immediately. Seal the Sump district, all sectors. Engage all primary and emergency pressure bulkheads between the Sump and the mid-levels. Lock down all vertical transit, all of it. Sever primary conduits for water, power, and atmospheric exchange. Full quarantine, no exceptions. The hull is the whole." On the schematic, a brutal red line appeared, cutting the Sump off from the rest of the city. Alarms, distant and muted, began to chime in the Spire's command center, miles away. The system was obeying her. She turned back to the 2 statues at the table. Their horror had been replaced by a new expression, the blank shock of absolute defeat. They had been rendered irrelevant in less than a minute. They were no longer governors, they were passengers. "You have just condemned thousands of people to die," Ilara whispered, tears finally tracing paths on her cheeks. Praxilla looked at her, her expression unreadable. "No, matron," she said, the words utterly final. "I have just saved the city." It began not with a siren, but with a sound that was not heard, but felt. A deep, abyssal trench resonance that vibrated up through the soles of worn work boots and into the bone marrow. It was the sound of the city's skeleton shifting, a groan that promised movement on a scale no one living had ever witnessed.
In the G-Deck Market Square, a space between repurposed cargo containers where illicit glimmer moths cast a ghostly green-gold glow on haggard faces, conversation stopped. A woman bartering for a sliver of real salt froze, her hand hovering over the chipped, jeweled chit. A child's laughter died in his throat. All eyes lifted, searching the weeping, pipe-strewn ceiling as if they could see through the kilometers of metal and water to the source of the disturbance. Then came the second sound, a grinding, a slow geological grinding of rust-caked gears that had been dormant for decades. It was the sound of a tomb preparing to seal itself. A klaxon, shrill and panicked, finally blared to life, its electronic shriek almost comical against the tectonic movement already underway. It was an afterthought. The decision had already been made. Panic erupted. A wave of humanity surged from the market square towards the main transit corridor leading to the mid-level lifts. Shouts tore through the ozonic air. "The Spire! They're sealing us in!" someone screamed, the words dissolving into a raw plea. At the entrance to Corridor Beta 9, a colossal pressure door, 20 meters wide and caked in 70 years of brine and black mold, had begun its inexorable descent. Its surface, slick with condensation, reflected the sickly orange work lamps and distorted, weeping streaks. The gap between its groaning lower edge and the deck plating was shrinking. 10 meters. 9. 8. A tide of bodies pressed against the opening, a desperate bottleneck. A man lost his footing, swallowed by the trampling feet. A woman made it through, then turned, her face a mask of horror, screaming for a son or husband who was still on the wrong side.
"Get through! Rust-rot, move!" a tighter lord bellowed, shoving people forward, his authority evaporating in the face of absolute mechanics. The grinding was louder now, a pulverizing roar that drowned out individual screams, blending them into a single high-pitched frequency of terror. The gap was 5 meters. A pushcart loaded with salvaged tech overturned, scattering pre-inundation relics across the deck. No one stopped to pick them up. The door did not slow. Its shadow fell over the frantic crowd. 3 meters. 2. On the bridge itself, it was hell. The narrow walkway was a solid mass of people, a human current flowing in 2 directions at once as the realization dawned that both ends were closing. The grinding of the 2 opposing pressure doors was a stereo chorus of doom. The crowd compacted, a press of bodies so tight that breathing became a conscious effort. A young welder, no older than 20, tried to climb the safety railing, his fingers scrabbling for purchase on the slick, cold metal. He looked back at the crush, his face blank with a terror that had moved beyond sound. He saw the doors, their massive teeth-like locking mechanisms ready to engage, and he simply let go, dropping into the unlit abyss between the stacks. Praxilla watched the 2 blue lines on her map touch. The red icon for the gantry flickered once, then stabilized. "Report casualties," she commanded, her voice perfectly level. The officer hesitated. Ma'am, all internal sensors in the sealed zones are unreliable. We can only confirm the lockdown is successful." "The lockdown is the only metric that matters," she replied. She made a gesture with 2 fingers, and a new set of commands scrolled in the air. System command, initiate Sump life support severance. System command, divert water reclamation cycle 3 theta. Confirm, Y, N. She pressed her thumb against the Y. On the map, a dozen vital green lines feeding into the red Sump sectors winked out. Power, water, air. One by one, the umbilicals were cut. In a cramped habitation pod in the lowest level of the Sump, Eldrick stood with Jorin. The old welder didn't run. He had watched the initial surge of panic with a weary sadness. Now he simply stood by the thick plasteel porthole, his hand resting on the cold surface. Outside, in the narrow access way, the final gate was descending. It wasn't loud from here. Just a persistent, grinding vibration that hummed through the walls. It blotted out the dim light from the next corridor section by agonizing section. Jorin was not watching the door. He was clutching his head, his eyes squeezed shut. The fear of the trapped, the agony of the crushed, the sudden sharp silence of the fallen, it was all a screaming cacophony inside his skull. It wasn't just memories of the dead anymore. It was the raw living terror of thousands, a psychic tidal wave that threatened to tear his own consciousness apart. He could feel their heartbeats, a frantic stuttering drumbeat against the grinding of the gears. Eldrick looked from the closing door to Jorin, his face a roadmap of dawning horror, not at the quarantine, but at the pained convulsions racking his friend. He saw a faint, almost imperceptible shimmering pattern on Jorin's skin, a ghostly bioluminescence around his temples. The last sliver of external light vanished. The world outside their porthole was now absolute, abyssal black. A moment later, a final, resonant clang echoed through the structure, followed by the deep, satisfying thud of magnetic locks engaging. It was a sound of utter finality. The sound of a key turning in a lock the size of a city block. The low-frequency thrum of Amphitrite's turbines, the constant companion of every citizen's life, was suddenly muffled, distant. They were acoustically, physically, completely isolated. In the Spire Command Center, the holographic map showed the Sump as a solid, inert block of red, a perfect containment. The city's structural integrity readouts, once flickering with amber warnings, now glowed a serene, uniform green. The deep groans that had been felt even in the atrium ceased. Praxilla Var took a slow, measured breath. The sharp scent of ozone from the server banks and the sterile, recycled air filled her lungs. She had cut away the cancer. The screaming from the comms relays had stopped, filtered into oblivion by her command. The hull was the whole, and the whole was now quiet, stable. She saw her own reflection in the dark, mirrored surface of the main console. Her expression was unreadable, her posture unwavering. She was the warden of Amphitrite, the savior. She had silenced the disease. And in the perfect, heavy silence she had created, she could almost believe it.